Pranam Dar, and welcome back everyone to the final session of our Homelessness Symposium. I hope you've enjoyed the day so far. I've certainly really enjoyed listening to all of our fantastic speakers talking about strategies, action plans, data, action both within Wales, but also some of the activity that's been happening across the UK. We're now going global, and I'm really pleased that we're going to be joined by the Institute of Global Homelessness. Absolutely delighted that Lydia, who is Director of IGH, is joining us all the way from Chicago. The Institute of Global Homelessness has worked with cities across the globe, often cities in very different situations when it comes to homelessness, with really different structures and cultures and levels of homelessness. But we're really keen to hear how the Institute has been supporting those cities to tackle homelessness within their cities, and to make sure that homelessness is reduced across the globe. So really pleased to invite Lydia. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please do have your questions for Lydia in the Q&A, and please share your reflections in the chat. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Lydia. Welcome, Lydia.
Thank you so much, Katie. I'm really thrilled to be with you all today. Good afternoon to you all. I know you've had a long day of learning behind you and just kind of one session ahead. So it's just past 9 a.m. here in Chicago, and I've had probably a little bit too much coffee. So hopefully I can bring the energy and we can have a really good discussion about the issue of homelessness globally. All right, just learning how to navigate my slides here. So I wanted to share just a little bit about the Institute of Global Homelessness. When we think about tackling the issue of homelessness globally, we think about it using our tagline, see it, solve it, share it. So the first category, see it, is really around the need for homelessness to be defined globally and to be measured globally. Different countries define homelessness differently. They measure homelessness differently, as I know you all are aware. And so really working at the international level through the United Nations to bring some standardization to international homelessness policy. I'll be talking more about that towards the end of the presentation. Most of my talk with you all this morning is around the second category, solve it, where IGH partners with 13 different international cities that are really ready to take concrete action to end homelessness. But then finally, our last area of work is around sharing what works. So similar to this, we do different conferences and summits and convenings, as well as we have worked with a couple of other universities to establish the International Journal on Homelessness, which is a peer-reviewed academic journal that looks at the issue of homelessness through a global lens. And so, you know, I know after this, there will be many ways that we can stay involved, sharing the learnings and connecting into this global movement of all of us that are working to end homelessness. So that's a little bit about IGH. This is just a map of the 13 communities where we work around the world. So you'll see kind of up in Canada, we work in Edmonton, Alberta. Moving down into the United States, we work in Chicago. We felt that that was appropriate, what with IGH being headquartered here. We also work in Little Rock, Arkansas in the southern United States. Moving down into South America, we work in Montevideo, Uruguay, and in Santiago, Chile. Then kind of moving across the globe, we work in Shwane, South Africa, in Bengaluru, India, and in Sydney and Adelaide in Australia. Moving up into Europe, we work in Rijeka, Croatia, Brussels, Belgium, Glasgow, Scotland, and Greater Manchester in England. So you can see that we have a very diverse cohort of areas where we work. As Katie mentioned, the context is very different in all of these communities. And it's really a wonderful learning and sharing cohort of people who are committed to working on homelessness, committed to ending homelessness, and learning from each other about what's working and what's not working, because we really believe that we learn just as much as from failure as we do from success. So just to share a little bit more, we called it sort of our 2020 cohort. We work in 12 cities, but one state. So, Sydney, Australia actually has expanded their work across the state of New South Wales. So interesting to work both at sort of a city and a regional level there. Each of these cities has set a really ambitious quantitative goal in a formal memorandum of joint commitment that's signed by multiple stakeholders, including representatives from government and civil society. That is really important to IGH because we know that no one agency, no one actor is responsible for ending homelessness. It really takes all of us working in partnership and working in community to see significant progress on the issue of homelessness. As I mentioned before, it's really a peer learning community. So sharing successes, sharing challenges, learning from each other how to do this work a little bit better, a little bit smarter, a little bit faster. IGH works behind the scenes to connect different communities to experts where that's needed, connection to different types of resources, providing some research on behalf of our partners. IGH really, in a sense, is providing some backbone services, doing what we can to help those communities make progress towards those goals that they set. Our initial timeline was to kind of conclude our current cohort in December of 2020. Well, we all know what 2020 meant to the world, and so we really have kind of extended that timeline due to the pandemic. We all felt that we needed this community to continue supporting and learning from each other as we all grappled with what COVID-19 meant for the work. So we're gonna dive down into some of the different communities around the world. So we're gonna be traveling globally, though virtually, together this morning. And I've just pulled together a few different examples of some of the incredible work that our cities have been doing together over the last 3 years. So the first thing I wanted to spotlight was really some successes in involving people with lived experience. So our partners in Chicago manage 2 different advisory groups of people with the lived experience of homelessness. One is called the Lived Experience Commission, and the second is called the Youth Action Board. Youth homelessness is a problem here in Chicago, and we definitely need the experiences and the insights of young people who have been homeless in the city to help advise on strategy and help us do the work of ending youth homelessness here in a better way. So also in Chicago, 2 people with lived experience sit on literally every committee on homelessness across the city. And it's a lot of committees, as you can imagine. We also have a requirement where every single service provider organization has to have at least 1 person of lived experience on their board of directors. So again, beginning to bring in that expertise of people with lived experience at all different levels. It's a little complicated in Chicago, but we have something called the Continuum, which is essentially responsible for making policy decisions around homelessness here in Chicago. That Continuum has 5 people with lived experience on their board. 2 people with lived experience are on the Continuum's executive committee, and the chairmanship of that board rotates every 3 years to a person with lived experience. So again, a significant amount of seats are reserved for people with lived experience at that policy-making board. One thing I think that is also unique around how Chicago involves people with lived experience is that they have kind of a secret shopper program where people with lived experience will kind of anonymously drop into different service providers and then report back on their experience. Were they treated with dignity? Were they able to access the services that they needed? Were they given support in navigating a really complex kind of service provision landscape within the city? And they provide those evaluations to the service providers. And this has been a really interesting experience to kind of watch some of those tensions come out. Service providers, often are very sensitive and very defensive to the feedback that's coming from people who are essentially their customers. And so I think that even though this can be really a tough, some tough conversations come out of that, I think it's also very, very meaningful. And again, kind of shows how we need that lived expertise at all these different levels, from the service provision to the policy, to the various committees and service provider agencies. The continuum that I talked about, kind of that policymaking board, does have an organization that provides some backbone services to that board. And that backbone provides administrative support to both the Lived Experience Commission and the Youth Action Board. So making sure that members understand the responsibilities of these various boards, that someone helps to set meetings, take minutes at those meetings, kind of keep the work of these groups moving. And each person with lived experience who's on these boards and committees does receive a small stipend. It's not much, but it is provided to cover the cost of their travel and their time. So that's just one example from Chicago, from my hometown, that I think that they're doing some very interesting and positive work in really meaningfully engaging people with lived experience. So now we're going to be traveling over to, oh gosh, my screen is hiding. So this is going to be Glasgow. I can't see Glasgow, but I know from my bullets that that's where it is. So we're really, really proud of our colleagues in Glasgow. Through the pandemic, they were able to achieve and maintain very low numbers of rough sleeping in their center city. So they have between 5 and 10 people sleeping rough kind of on any given night. And they have, as I mentioned, been able to maintain that level even to this point in sort of the pandemic world that we're living in. In other communities, we've seen numbers reduce drastically using sort of hotel and temporary accommodations, but those numbers begin to cycle up as some of those supports end. But in Glasgow, they've been able to maintain that. Some of the things that they've done that have been very successful is taking resources to people on the street, including digital access to services and telehealth services, and intensive case management delivered right there on the street versus having, the people living on the street have to move to travel to different agencies to receive those services. So that's been a very successful strategy for them. They have been using a model sort of called rapid rehousing, which is, once somebody does become homeless, how quickly can we move them to their permanent accommodation? Let's not have them languish in shelters or temporary accommodations or B&Bs, but let's move them very quickly to their permanent accommodation. And that has really allowed them to scale down the size of their emergency accommodation, their emergency response. So they don't have large shelters. They don't have a lot of temporary accommodation, and they've been able to move, as you'll see on the next bullet, they've been able to move that temporary accommodation and use that more as settled homes for people. They are working hand in hand with the health services providers there. Glasgow, unfortunately, is kind of the number one in, I think, the entire UK for opioid overdose. So they are really struggling to deal with that. And so that connection between the substance use and homelessness has really required them to work very deeply with the health services providers. And so they have been able to create this multi-agency response that focuses on multiple different things that all feed into homelessness. So mental health, harm reduction strategies, critical time interventions, all of these components to provide that holistic service to people experiencing homelessness. Downtown, they do have an access hub that allows for that coordination of services, many different agencies in one location providing those holistic services to people experiencing homelessness. So it's really a centralized access point that then allows them to very successfully move people on from their experience of homelessness into permanent accommodation. So I'm really proud to be working with our colleagues there in Glasgow. So now we're traveling down to India. Again, some incredible work happening with our colleagues in Bengaluru over the past 3 years. They secured a significant amount of private philanthropic investment. They also have been working in a very strong sort of collaborative advocacy model. So many years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that for every 100,000 people within a city, one homeless shelter needed to be open. But that their state government has not made good on that Supreme Court ruling. And so they have continued for many years to be strongly advocating for that, and just recently, won some movement on that. So the state government there is now beginning to push forward some funds. So that mix of the private philanthropic investment with the government investment that's continuing to flow has allowed them to open 10 new shelters. Now, I want to make the point that shelter is a little bit different in this context. So, for our colleagues in Glasgow, for sort of really anyone who's working in a more developed economy, we would not necessarily recommend shelters, right? But in Bengaluru, shelters are essentially functioning as permanent congregate housing. It has to do with their housing market. It has to do with a lot of different types of things. And so we need to kind of, check our Western perceptions of what shelter is and understand that shelter is a really excellent strategy for them. And this is a very positive move to have these new shelters opened. They've also established a mobile outreach van that, again, is going out and engaging with people on the street in the services that they can offer. And I want to pause on this next bullet because I think it is really a notable achievement when you think about how hard India has been hit with COVID. In these 10 shelters that our colleagues there opened, 0 lives were lost due to COVID. An incredible amount of work was done to connect people in the shelters to the vaccines, to give them personal protective equipment, to provide them with daily yoga and activities during those really tough days of lockdown when people were living in these congregate housing spaces. So again, incredible work by our colleagues there to maintain the health and safety of people living in those shelters. They've also established a new database that gathers and shares the information between those 10 different shelters. So again, thinking about how can we collect and use data to serve the people who are experiencing homelessness better there, as well as over time begin to analyze some of the trends of where people are coming from, how they are entering homelessness, how they are exiting homelessness. So some really interesting and positive things to share from our colleagues in India. So now we're traveling down into South Africa, into Tshwane. So again, a couple of really excellent things to share from South Africa. So they established a new homelessness task team, which was hosted, interestingly, within the University of Pretoria. They've established a unit for street homelessness. So again, kind of bringing in that academic lens. How can academia work with service providers on a particular social issue? And so this group really comes together to operationalize a relatively new and progressive city homelessness policy. So in 2019, after several years of advocacy, the city did pass a comprehensive policy on street homelessness. And this is believed to be the first of its kind in the entire continent. And so, certainly different communities in South Africa, but also different communities from different countries in Africa are really looking at Tshwane to see if they can replicate this policy at different city levels. And it's very comprehensive. And so that was passed in 2019, and it's taken some time to begin to operationalize it. But again, some opportunities through COVID-19 allowed them to really get into the work of what applying this homelessness policy will look like. And that's being led by this group between the service providers and the university. So again, some good collaboration and partnership there. They've started 2 Housing First pilot projects there. Their particular population that those pilots are serving is older people. In Tshwane, a significant amount of people living on the street are over 65. And so they've declared that age group as one of their priority populations to make sure that they are served well. There again, they have opened, this is through COVID, these shelters have opened as a result of COVID, 27 different shelters that served a total of 2,000 people and provided psychosocial health support, a methadone program. So again, you see that intersection between healthcare and homeless services. Across the world, across all of our partners, we have seen that the opportunity that COVID-19 presented to begin to bring these different systems around health and around homelessness together. And certainly you can see that here in Schwane, coming together to open these shelters and service centers to provide that holistic, comprehensive service provision to people experiencing homelessness. One thing that's not on my slide that I think is really interesting to share is in the early days of the pandemic, the government of Schwane thought that it would be just a brilliant idea to set aside a football stadium, so a massive football stadium, and create one giant shelter. And our colleagues very strongly advocated against that type of just massive congregate setting. They had security concerns, they had provision concerns, and so the government did listen to that. And that was when they decided, okay, instead of one giant congregate shelter in open football stadium, we will go ahead and split out into smaller different shelters around the city. So that was a huge success, and I think shows the willingness of those partners to speak up, but also to listen and come together with a much better plan that ultimately would better serve people experiencing homelessness. So they are also working really hard in Schwane to improve their homelessness data collection. They did a citywide street count in 2021. They kind of piloted it in some different communities around the city, and they're going to be fully implementing that next year. So again, kind of running these parallel streams of collaboration and service provision, and testing out some different pilots and models, as well as beginning to improve their data collection. So in some ways similar to what Bengaluru has been doing as well. All right, so next we are going to Santiago in Chile. So there in Santiago, the government is really responsible for leading the overall response to homelessness. So the government coordinates service providers, they coordinate their own government agencies, they also bring in academia and data analysts, so that they really, even though they're the coordinating and centralizing partner, they're bringing in the different perspectives from every kind of sector that touches different aspects of homelessness. They have upgraded their shelters to provide 24/7 services. They added some additional winter shelters. So again, really working to figure out what is the appropriate emergency response there. Again, here we see them beginning to test out different housing first pilots for vulnerable, particularly vulnerable people living on the street. I think they also have prioritized people who are older, are over 65, and people who have underlying health conditions. So again, kind of looking at their population of people experiencing homelessness and making some tough decisions about who to prioritize for what types of housing and services. They also are doing a great job in terms of increasing their data collection and their data quality to really begin to understand how are people arriving on the street, what's working best in terms of moving them off the street. One really interesting thing that has come out of the COVID-19 pandemic there in Santiago is they, historically have had a very, very tough relationship between law enforcement and people living on the street. That's not unique to Santiago. We see that in many, many communities around the world. But they shared with us that during the pandemic, the police officers, on the streets, they really were engaging in much more positive ways with people experiencing homelessness. They were able to literally use the police officers to take packages of PPE to people living on the streets. And it just, it kind of changed that dynamic, and they began to be seen more as trusted partners in that work, which was a really very positive development. And now they're looking to kind of expand their trainings countrywide. So the majority of homelessness in Chile is in the cities, but they do have rural homelessness as well. And so given that the government is responsible for kind of coordinating this response, they're beginning to kind of expand out. Okay, so we've tried these things. We're increasing our data collection. We've implemented our housing first in Santiago. Now, how do we begin to kind of expand that out across the country? So again, some really, really wonderful and interesting things to learn from our partners in Chile. So those were just some of the different examples that I wanted to share with you from around the world. We'll really be curious as we get into the Q&A portion of our conversation, how those examples hit you, what you found surprising, what you found encouraging, what you'd like to learn more about. So definitely be putting those comments into the chat and into the Q&A as we go. We'll be really happy to answer those as we get into that component. So. Now we're beginning to look ahead. We had thought that 2020 would be the wind down of this cohort. We've obviously extended that a little bit more and have some really, really rich learning coming out of this first cohort. I think you all heard from Suzanne Fitzpatrick earlier today. She and her research team are doing an independent evaluation for us on that program model, speaking with each community about what worked and what didn't, and how IGH could be kind of a better support to our future cohorts. So that should be concluded at the end of this year. And we are using those learnings and those findings to gear up for our next cohort. So in 2022, we will be launching our next 3-year cohort of cities. So this cohort will end its work in 2025. We are still going to continue mostly with cities. We're going to expand to a couple of different states, and we're looking at engaging a couple of countries as well to look at what this work can look like nationally as well as regionally and locally. So kind of tiering those different stakeholder groups together. We're going to be providing some tiered support. So one of the things that we knew all along in the first cohort is that different communities are at different points in their journeys towards ending homelessness. So, for example, our colleagues in Glasgow and in Chicago have incredibly sophisticated and really successful, ways of addressing homelessness. They don't necessarily need us to connect them with different expertise, although that has happened at certain points in both of those communities. But really the value and the role that we've been able to play in those communities is much more around the advocacy. So, helping to engage with different government officials who maybe need moved on different points, and to use sort of the international expertise and community to kind of validate and back up the different policy or program approaches that they're pushing. So really in recognition of that, we will be providing, different levels of support to different communities and really tailoring our IGH kind of package of support to what those communities need to move forward. We also learned that we need to be setting a mix of goals. We will always set ambitious quantitative goals, but we also want to be more thoughtful about setting qualitative goals as well. So, we discussed Schwane, for example. At the end of 3 years, we can't necessarily say if homelessness decreased measurably in Schwane because they had to do so much work over that 3 years to get their baseline count done. And so in the next cohort, being able to say, set a goal around establishing a baseline or set a goal around passing a city policy on homelessness, because as you've seen, Schwane has made incredible progress over the last 3 years. But if you look at the actual measurable quantitative goal that they set, we can't necessarily say if they hit that or not because the baseline data wasn't there. I hope that makes sense how I'm articulating it, but long story short, setting a mix of goals, the quantitative goals and the qualitative goals, will help us get a better sense of how a community is making progress. Supporting those goals even more strongly through action planning, regular data collection. A lot of that work will be on IGH's staff team to make sure that, okay, those goals are set. Now we have a clear pathway for how we hope to achieve those goals, and providing that regular kind of check-in, gentle accountability to make sure that things are all progressing according to plan. Another component that we are really going to beef up for the next cohort is looking at the issue of homelessness through an inclusive equity lens. So one thing that we have learned is that around the world, no matter what your minoritized or oppressed population is, they will be overly represented in the demographics of people who experience homelessness. So, for example, in Chicago, that's our Black and African American neighbors. In Chicago, 13% of the overall population is Black, but 80% of our homeless population is Black. And so an incredible disparity there. Clearly some discrimination and some systemic racism are causing our Black neighbors to become homeless at much greater rates than our white neighbors. So that needs to be named, needs to be paid attention to, and we need to take some action based off of that. This is not unique to the United States. Our colleagues that work in Canada and in Australia see similar trends with their Aboriginal neighbors, the Indigenous people. For our colleagues in India, it's people in lower castes who become homeless at higher rates. So again, across the world, this is a theme that we see, and we want our communities to grow in their comfort at naming that and coming up with strategies that will really address those racial disparities. Again, things that we'll carry forward are the richness of this peer learning community and the connections that they made with each other to share successes, to talk frankly about challenges, and to just learn from each other how to do this work better. And that commitment to understanding that all of us have things that we can learn and improve on, and tapping into this wealth of knowledge, essentially a brain trust of really talented and passionate people working on this issue. We'll continue, but work to expand kind of our bench of experts that we can connect our communities with, expand our ability to connect them to resources, to do research on their behalf, or to connect them with some compelling research to provide that piece of insight as well. And also, as I mentioned, we do a significant amount of work now at the international level through the United Nations. And so creating those pathways for our Vanguard cities to connect with that work, whether that be sharing examples to different countries, different member states of the United Nations that are interested in doing a better job of addressing homelessness, coming alongside us on some advocacy campaigns for the work that we're doing there, and just really kind of connecting from the local to the regional to the national to the international. That homelessness exists in every single corner of the world. And so bringing that rich learning to the international context is something that we feel very, very passionate about. So that kind of concludes my Vanguard Cities component of the presentation. So again, please be putting questions, comments, thoughts in the chat and in the Q&A. And now we're going to talk really just for the next 7 minutes or so about our work with the United Nations. So I had to learn a ton about the UN when I stepped into this role, and I learned a lot of things that frankly really surprised me. So historically, homelessness has been completely absent from the United Nations development agenda. I think there's a lot of reasons for this. I think one reason is that massive gap between people experiencing homelessness and people who are in power and who set the policy. And so, one of the things that we are doing is working to kind of close that gap and to bring people with lived experience into the halls of the United Nations to tell their stories, to share their experience, to share their ideas about solutions. But, usually, historically, it's been very, very absent. It has not been present there. So the current set of 17 sustainable development goals, the SDGs, these goals were negotiated and went into effect in 2015. So not really that long ago. There are 17 goals. Each of those goals has a series of indicators attached to them. Altogether, they have 169 indicators. So a significant number of indicators that talk about, how they're going to achieve these different and how they're going to measure achieving these different international goals. In this entire set, there is zero mention of homelessness. So again, completely absent. And our aim is to change that. Our aim is to bring attention to this issue that affects every single country and community in the world. And we have made some really incredible progress over the past couple years in terms of raising homelessness as an issue that needs to be addressed in these international policy venues. So in 2020, the UN Working Group to End Homelessness, of which IGH is a founding member and on the executive board of, we were able to advocate for a resolution from the United Nations Commission on Social Development. This resolution was negotiated by member states, and it did a very good job of connecting homelessness to these goals to say, there's no way we will be able to end poverty, which is SDG number 1, if we don't also pay attention to the issue of homelessness. There is no way that we can have sustainable cities, which is goal 11, without addressing homelessness. So kind of walking through and connecting homelessness to these goals was something that resolution did. It also described global homelessness. So it's the best step forward we have in terms of a definition of homelessness, although it's more of a description, but it uses essentially a 3-tiered definition. So the first component of that is people who are literally homeless, living on the streets, living in cars or rickshaws or in places not meant for human habitation. Then it talks about people who are living in temporary or crisis accommodations, so shelters or domestic violence refuges, things like that. And then third, it caveats it. It says, based on national legislation, homelessness may also include a third category of homelessness. So people living in inadequate or insecure accommodation. So doubled up, living with family and friends, that kind of hidden homelessness that we think about. And then it did a third really important thing, which is to call for disaggregated data collection around the world. So you'll remember in my very first slide, I talked about how countries define and measure homelessness very differently. And so this is asking member states to do a better job of defining homelessness in their context, of measuring that homelessness, so that we can get to a point where we can compare apples to apples and say, this is the scope of the problem globally. This is where things are working. This is where things are not working, and really begin to create kind of that peer learning at that international level. So that 2020 resolution was a huge win. We wanted to make sure it did not stop with that resolution. And so we worked very hard behind the scenes. And I'm happy to say that we've established between IGH and an agency called UN Habitat. It is a UN agency, and it's the agency responsible for goal 11 that I mentioned. So they're responsible for the sustainable cities and human settlements component of the SDGs. So I think a relationship there with them makes a ton of sense because though, obviously a lot of homelessness does happen in rural areas, the majority of it does happen in urban areas. So IGH and UN Habitat now have a formal memorandum of understanding together. And so through that MOU, we've committed to working hand in hand with them to continue to raise awareness of homelessness at the United Nations, to co-convene a global homeless data initiative of the world's kind of leading thinkers and experts, including people with lived expertise, to talk about and plan for what standardized global homeless data collection could look like. And then the third stream of work with them will be to continue to coordinate training, capacity building, education for local and national governments interested in addressing homelessness. And I know that you all in Wales are doing some incredible work on homelessness. And so, would be my pleasure to help connect you into these avenues where it makes sense for you to come along and talk about the work that you're doing in Wales, and become kind of a model for other areas around the world that are interested in doing this work better. So I think that brings me to the end of my presentation, just 1 minute shy of the 40 minutes that Katie and the team had given me. And so we really just hope that this was an interesting conversation for you all. We have an online community of impact, which you can find at our website. I've got the link there, ighomelessness.org, if you'd like to come along and join that learning community. We are on all the social medias you can think of. And finally, I've left my email there and would just love to hear from you as you've got time. So that's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Spot on timing. Well done. You get a kind of special award for that. But no, that was absolutely fascinating. I think, we're so busy sometimes with our heads down in the context in either the city or the local authority or the country that we're working in. And it's really fascinating to kind of look up and hear about what's going on across the world, and some really, really different contexts that some of those cities that are in, but some really interesting commonalities as well. And that was something that really struck me. So thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. What a brilliant session to end the day on. So we've had a few questions come in. So one of them, we've talked about the different contexts and the different cities and the different kind of stages that they're at in terms of the homelessness journey. But were there some kind of consistent or common critical success factors or enablers that, regardless of the context, those were the things that made stuff happen?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, this is what we're thinking about all of the time at IGH. Like, is there a core set of things that can be applied across multiple contexts? And the answer, somewhat surprisingly, but somewhat unsurprisingly, is yes, there are. So some of those critical things that have made all the difference is, one, when you have government leadership that is very passionate about this issue, that is willing to make noise about it, and that is willing to set forward some resources to deal with it. That can be mayoral leadership, that can be sort of a state or national leadership, but really at all levels, that's a really key component to success. And I know that you've got that in Wales. And another thing that we see that is really important is that idea of working in collaboration, that it's not just service providers, but it's service providers, it's government, it's academia, it's even in some communities, businesses are getting engaged in the issue of homelessness. And again, I think it comes back to how complex an issue homelessness is across contexts. It's extremely complex. No one sector, no one agency can do it alone. We need to be tackling this problem in community. And I think it's actually a really, a beautiful sort of philosophical thing, right? Like, homelessness, I think at its core is a loss of community. And so what is required to end homelessness is that community coming back together, bringing together solutions that will support the person who lost that community, and bring them back into that. So that's a second component. And then the third component is sort of a spectrum of choices, right? So just as no one agency can end homelessness, no one program can end homelessness, right? And so we need to be looking at, okay, what is the right mix of housing and services options? So, in some places like Glasgow, they need, smaller amounts of emergency accommodation. Other communities that are still on their journey to end homelessness need a much larger sort of stock, for lack of a better word, of emergency accommodation. And how does that mix change over time? And so right along with that, you need data collection to be able to make those decisions. So how many people are becoming homeless every month? How many people are we successfully putting into permanent accommodation every month? How many people are sustaining that accommodation over 6, 12, 2 years? And using that data will help communities to make that decision around how to flex and adapt that mix of services. So those are some of the things that we see regularly showing up in communities that are most successful at addressing homelessness.
And that last point ties in really nicely to the session that we had prior to this one, where we're hearing from the Centre for Homeless Impact about data collection. And we talked about that kind of tension between the overwhelming pressures that are on services at the moment, and setting up data systems can sometimes feel like, oh, that's the nice to do thing. But actually, you're agreeing with them about the importance of that, the centrality of that to understanding the progress that you're making.
That's right. I mean, that's the only, there's this old sort of management maxims, like what gets measured is what gets done. And I think we've been measuring, I think in some ways, the wrong sides over the past 20, 30 years in homelessness, right? Like the old measures used to be, how many people did we give meals to? How many nights of accommodation did we provide? Rather than, I think, being, measuring what are the results of our programs, how many people are actually exiting homelessness in sustainable ways. So we've got to flip that on its head. And I will say, we talk regularly with frontline workers. We know none of us went into this work to be putting information into data systems. We know it is such a heavy lift. We have examples, from many, many different communities around just how tough that is to do. So I say it, with a lot of empathy for that. But again, a gentle challenge that this is how we actually end homelessness. And that's why we all went into this work.
Definitely. We've had a few questions in, particularly asking about health services. And I think you referenced that as part of the response to COVID, there seemed to be a greater partnership between health and homelessness. And so we've had some questions about, how do we get that buy-in from health, particularly mental health? Are there examples in some of the Vanguard cities that you've worked with where there has been certain things that have made that partnership work, whether it be kind of leadership or, systems or anything like that? Because I think that's one of the really tough things that we're dealing with in Wales is how to get better join up between the homelessness and the health systems.
Yes. So that is, I would say, when we kind of surveyed across all our 13 communities around, what was happening during COVID, I think the number one thing that every single community said, so this was consistent across all of our Vanguard communities, was COVID-19 forced collaboration and forced collaboration with the health sector. So I think we are at the perfect kind of moment to talk about, okay, how do we kind of institutionalize some of these relationships that were, sort of randomly thrown together by this pandemic. So I think it happens at multiple levels, right? So definitely it happens at the leadership level, right? Like one thing, so the chair of IGH's board is Dame Louise Casey, who she said to me, she was just able to sort of walk down the hall to the health minister's office and say, we need to get together on this. So that it happens at those levels. So whatever kind of national or municipal level leaders that you have overseeing those two different streams of work, having them talk and see those intersections is a really important component. Then I think very practically and logistically, I think about the Glasgow Access Hub, right? Where you have multiple agencies with a desk or like a small sub office within a larger office where people can come and engage in a mental health check-in, a physical health check-in, and sort of the housing and homeless services side. One thing that I think is unique to the United States, because we have we have no sort of, very little kind of national health care, right? But here in the United States, our like national health insurance is like paid out through private companies. And those private companies have realized how much money they're spending on people who are homeless because they're cycling in and out of emergency rooms and accessing the most expensive forms of care. And so many of those private company payers are beginning to invest in the homeless services system, and to begin to, they're investing in the data collection, they're investing in the creation of bricks and mortar housing, they're investing in services because that's literally cheaper for them than to just continue to pay out for people who are experiencing homelessness. And so I have no idea if there's any kind of analogy that's anything close to that for Wales, but just I think another interesting layer to think about. What are the businesses making money through sort of healthcare? What businesses might be losing money based on healthcare?
And I think that applies to different government departments as well, because I think one of the really strong arguments is the kind of cost to the health service of homelessness. And the sort of health inequalities that people experience, and then that pressure that is put on things like accident and emergency departments and
Yep.
or, you know, the quite high cost interventions that are required, and, you know, trying to communicate to the health ministers that this is as much in your interest to help us to end homelessness in Wales in terms of the pressure that your services are experiencing at the moment. I think the really difficult thing is, you know, the pressure that's certainly going to be on health services in our country as a result of COVID. So the backlog of you know, operations, the sort of mental health issues that have come up, you know, through COVID and the isolation, and then, you know, homelessness is another thing that's knocking on the door saying, you know, could you do more here? But I think that there's probably need for a variety of solutions. So yes, we want better access to the main healthcare system, but also having co-location like you described, or having, you know, specialist mental health or substance use workers within outreach teams or homelessness teams, different ways that people can access those services.
And bringing it sort of back to the data again, I'm aware of a project out in Los Angeles in California on the western coast of the United States. They did a massive piece of work to connect data sets from health, homelessness, law enforcement, I think maybe even the education system to be able to kind of ping like people who were homeless and how they were accessing all these different services and extrapolating kind of a cost per person out of that shared data set. And it was astronomically high. And so they were able to then kind of use that data to say, okay, like if the cost associated across all these different agencies is this high, how can we invest at different points of the pipeline to, you know, keep people from experiencing homelessness and sort of have a cost savings in the long run?
Definitely. And I think, you know, recognising the Welsh Government said earlier, we need to do better in terms of our data systems. We've got bits of it. So we have some administrative health data that we can link with bits of the population. And that's been done in the past, linked with people using the housing support programme. And we published research a couple of years ago now that showed the kind of both the financial and the human benefits to other public services. So, but we need to get better at making that data, you know, more accessible and effective.
And I think the only caution on data is sometimes we get so caught up in the collection of it and the analyzing of it because it is so interesting is sometimes we slow down the action. So making sure that whatever data we are collecting and analyzing is used to make better decisions and take steps forward, because every number represents a human who's experiencing the trauma of being homelessness. And so even though we do talk about data a lot, remembering what the appropriate use of that data is for, I think needs to be a touchstone that we're constantly reminding ourselves of.
Definitely. And I think any support workers who are at the conference will be applauding that notion, because I know they've had to collect huge amounts of data in the past, and that's sometimes been quite a big burden that hasn't necessarily been seen as meaningful or useful. So it's got to be useful. It's got to mean something if we're going to ask people to collect it and spend their time doing so. Lydia, you mentioned during the presentation, and I know you're really passionate about this, about marginalised communities and the particular impact on them. And it's something that you ask of the organisations or the cities that you work with, isn't it? And so I wondered if you wanted to reflect a bit more on the importance of, you know, particularly we heard earlier about the Race Equality Action Plan from the Welsh Government and how housing can play its part. So I just wondered if you wanted to reflect on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we were talking about, you know, what are the themes that we see across all of our contexts, we talked about the positive themes, but there are some negative themes that are present across all of the contexts too. And that's one of them, unfortunately, that I talked about, which is, you know, whatever your minority or oppressed community is in your context, they will be overly represented in the number of people who experience homelessness. And so, you know, we believe very, very strongly that until we are comfortable talking about a really uncomfortable issue and recognizing it and grappling with it, and then putting solutions into place around that, you know, so different things we can think about. So it's not enough to just have like a statement around diversity and inclusion and equity. It can start there. But again, what concrete steps are you taking around this? As you think about incorporating people with lived experience into the conversations and into the decisions, also be making sure that you have people who represent those other communities as part of that conversation as well. They may be the same, but they may be different. So just bringing a real intentionality to setting those tables appropriately, and listening to those experiences. And that can be really hard for those of us who haven't grown up in those marginalized or oppressed communities, to say, well, I don't know, we might be prone to kind of not believe or to question, but really, kind of putting our own skepticism to the side and really listening to what those communities are experiencing and acknowledging that and working to change that. So there's some incredible work out of the National Social Work Association here in the United States around, okay, how are we as social workers accidentally acting in racist ways? How are we accidentally being racist with the assessments that we use, with the interventions that we are offering, those types of things. And so some really good, powerful toolkits and trainings from sort of the social work level. And, again, we ask our communities to make sure that you're collecting the inclusive data, the data on the demographics, so that we can be analyzing at each step of the way. Here in Chicago, we realized through some analysis that accidentally or purposefully, maybe that's the way the systems were set up from, the United States sort of history around racism, white people were being prioritized for housing at rates higher than Black people were being prioritized for housing, right? So the data can be used to shine a light on things that are happening either accidentally or intentionally. And so those are some of the really explicit and difficult and concrete ways that we are asking communities to engage in this. And we do it in partnership with these communities. Like IGH doesn't have it all figured out in terms of this issue. But what we are committed to is talking about it, and learning from each other about it, and working to do better at it.
Definitely. And I think that's, we heard about it right at the start of today's conference. And I think it's really important that we touch upon that issue. We've got so much more to do. We've had a question about the memorandum, I think with the UN, and someone asking how that came about. And I guess your full thoughts on that.
Yeah. So the work with the United Nations has been happening since 2017. So in 2017, the UN Working Group to End Homelessness was established. So it's a group of NGOs that are passionate about homelessness and got together to create this working group to begin to flip that script. Why is homelessness not being talked about here? Wild. How do we change this? How do we get homelessness included in these goals? And so that started in 2017. Lots of conversations with member states, lots of things happening behind the scenes. And in 2020, that commission chose homelessness for its annual theme to be discussed in 2020. And so so IGH, along with other members of that working group, were asked to come to, they call them expert group convenings, where they just kind of heard from people working in the sector around the world. We were asked to weigh in on different, language and provide different resources, and all of that turned into this resolution. And so through that, IGH was establishing relationships with different agencies within the United Nations. And so, we know sometimes resolutions stop right there. It's like some nice language that's put out, and everyone sort of pats themselves on the back and moves on. And we were just really determined not to. So, right away we were reaching out to our different colleagues at the United Nations to say, okay, how does this get operationalized? How do we move this forward? How can IGH be a resource to you? And through those conversations, that MOU was established. And so we're really excited about it, because we just want to be there to continue to support our UN colleagues who are also equally passionate about this, and connect them with, again, kind of research, partners, people around the world who we want to feature at the United Nations to make sure that learning is shared within those international halls.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you have done an incredible thing on the global stage, getting this agenda, up there right as a priority for the UN. So congratulations, Lydia. It's, brilliant to hear about your fantastic work, lobbying the UN and also supporting so many cities across the globe, and fantastic achievements, clearly, in all sorts of different circumstances and contexts. And I think Shirley in the chat has just said that was a fantastic insight in regards to homelessness across the world and the differing methods used to try and deal with it. And I think that's probably echoed by everyone. I found, I've already talked to you a few times about your work and the Vanguard Cities, but I found it hugely enjoyable and informative listening to that, Lydia. So thank you so much for joining us today at our Homelessness Symposium. It's been a real pleasure connecting with you. We hope to continue working with you and your organisation over the coming years, and to stay in touch as you look to progress action against homelessness globally, and hopefully we can play our part here in Wales. So thank you, Lydia. Absolutely fantastic to have you with us. So everyone else, thank you so much for participating in our conference today. We've had some fantastic questions in every session. We've had loads of really nice comments. And I hope that you've all found it really engaging, really informative, really interesting. I hope it's given you a lot of food for thought to take back with you. And I hope it's given you some really helpful information that will support you on the work that you're doing within your organisations and in your local authority areas. We're delighted to have had so many of you here with us today. We'd like to say a massive thank you to all of our speakers. They've all been utterly brilliant. I've certainly enjoyed the day, and I hope you have as well. I want to say a big shout out to my team, who are often behind the scenes, and especially on a virtual platform where you can't see them at all. But a special shout out to Mandy, to Nat and to Tanya, who have worked incredibly hard over the last few weeks to make sure that this event was up and running. They've been working away in NASA Control Centre behind the scenes, and I'd just like to say a big thank you to them for all of their hard work on this event. We'll be in touch very soon with an evaluation form. As ever, we're always looking to improve our events, so we'd be really, really grateful if you could fill out the short evaluation form that we circulated. It would be really helpful to help shape our thoughts on what our next conferences might look like. We'd also, we're going to be in touch with the recordings of this event so that you can watch back or share with colleagues, and we'll also share the presentations that you've seen today. So hopefully the evaluation form has just landed in your inbox. So if you do have 10 minutes, please do fill it out. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for all the comments. It's been really fantastic, and I really look forward to seeing you all at one of our future events. If I don't see you before, have a brilliant Christmas. Take a well-deserved break, because I know how hard all of you have worked over the last couple of years. And I know many of you will be working across the Christmas period, and we remain really grateful for everything that you and your teams do to support people experiencing homelessness. And we look forward to seeing everyone in the new year. Diolch yn fawr iawn, goodbye, and see you all soon. Take care.